I think an additional step that should be taken then is secondary sanctions, rather as opposed to secondary tariffs. Secondary sanctions would be sanctioning those entities and individuals that are actually doing the buying of Russian oil and gas or paying for it through banks or shipping it on vessels or taking it into ports. All of those entities involved in that trade, if they were sanctioned, they might actually want to get out of that because it's going to affect their business interests more directly.
President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff is heading to Moscow this week in a last-ditch effort to persuade President Putin to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. The US president has set a deadline of Friday for Russia to reach a deal with Ukraine or face further tariffs, which could include secondary tariffs on nations which continue to trade with Russia.
There'll be sanctions, but they seem to be pretty good at avoiding sanctions. You know, they're wily characters, and they're pretty good at avoiding sanctions. So we'll see what happens. But Steve is focused right now on the border in terms of, we're talking about with Gaza, getting people fed. And he may be going, I think next week, Wednesday or Thursday, may be going to Russia. They would like to see him. They've asked that he meet, so we'll see what happens.
Well, Russia has intensified its daily attacks on Ukraine, targeting civilians and residential infrastructure. President Trump has ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions in response to what he said were highly provocative comments by the former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. Let's speak to Kurt Volker, who's a former US ambassador to NATO, also a former special representative for Ukraine. Good evening to you, Kurt.
Good evening. Nice to be with you.
Well, really good to have you with us. First of all, Steve Witkoff heading to Moscow. President Trump has brought forward that deadline of Friday for Russia to actually finally agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. Do you think that there is a realistic prospect of Steve Witkoff getting a breakthrough here?
No, of course not. Vladimir Putin is determined to continue the war. He believes he can defeat Ukraine. He believes he can outlast any Western support. And as far as sanctions or tariffs or other things go, he's very complacent, and he wants to actually test it before making any decisions. He wants to see what happens. Witkoff will, of course, convey to Putin, look, this is, a last chance here. We want to make a deal. We want to have a way of reaching an agreement, start with an unconditional ceasefire, but Putin won't do that. And Trump is going to have to take tougher measures, sanctions, tariffs, and also reinforcing the military supplies for Ukraine.
President Trump, of course, famously said during his campaign he was going to solve the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Clearly, that hasn't happened. He has, though, been expressing growing exasperation at President Putin, including now bringing forward that deadline for Russia to agree to a ceasefire. Do you think that the US president is serious this time? We've seen him going backwards and forwards on various tariffs on various different countries. He's now saying not only that Russia could face further sanctions, and it's already under quite a few sanctions, but that he could impose those secondary sanctions on countries like India and China that are still trading with Russia.
Yeah. So first off, I think he's serious because this has gotten embarrassing. He, as you said, promised to end the war in a day, then 100 days, and then he has urged a ceasefire time and again. And Putin has mocked him. Putin has fired attacks on cities and civilians immediately after speaking with President Trump. So this is now something I think Trump is genuinely upset about. Now, as far as the sanctions and tariffs and things go, let's be clear. What Trump has talked about the most is putting 100% tariffs on countries that do trade with Russia, particularly in oil and gas, because this then would hopefully cause those countries to stop doing that, in which case would dry up revenue to the Kremlin's war budget. Now, the reality is it may not be that simple. You may have India or China, the two biggest countries buying Russian oil and gas, say, we'll just impose counter tariffs or we'll ride this out. We'll see how this goes. It may not result in what Trump wants it to result in. I think an additional step that should be taken then is secondary sanctions, as opposed to secondary tariffs. Secondary sanctions would be sanctioning those entities and individuals that are actually doing the buying of Russian oil and gas or paying for it through banks or shipping it on vessels or taking it into ports. All of those entities involved in that trade, if they were sanctioned, they might actually want to get out of that because it's going to affect their business interests more directly.
But I mean, we've seen President Putin, okay, the Russian economy is under pressure, but he seems to be perfectly capable of withstanding the quite significant sanctions that have already been imposed on his country. And there are plenty of ways around these things, as we've been seeing, imports that go via a third country, via a separate route. I mean, isn't the risk in all of this that none of those threats from President Trump has actually much effect, and certainly not in the short term?
Yeah, well, every little bit forces Russia to adjust and imposes a cost. Already they're losing money that they would have made without the sanctions. So, for instance, by selling oil to India, that oil then reprocesses and resells at a substantial profit. That's money that would have gone to Russia, that profit that is now going to India. But they're still getting the money from the original sale. But it is imposing some cost. We need to keep layering on and layering on these costs and reducing the exemptions. And again, the Biden administration, you have to remember, exempted Russian banks from sanctions if they were getting paid for energy. And that was because the US at the time wanted to avoid raising gasoline prices in the US. That is not something that is on Donald Trump's mind right now. He's actually making America a dominant energy exporter and is not worried about gasoline prices at the pump. So he's willing to actually close some of these loopholes and, in fact, has already begun to do so.
Let me just ask you about the latest in this war of words that we've had between President Trump and Russia, Russia in particular, its former president, Dmitry Medvedev. Because tonight on X, Medvedev has blamed NATO countries for abandoning what he said was a moratorium on short and medium-range nuclear missiles. In this post on X, Medvedev says the Russian foreign ministry's statement on the withdrawal of the moratorium on the deployment of medium and short-range missiles is the result of NATO countries' anti-Russian policy. This is the new reality all of our opponents will have to reckon with. Expect further steps. So he seems to be saying that Russia is now prepared to abandon this moratorium on short and medium range nuclear missiles. Now, I mean, Medvedev has been making all kinds of outspoken comments on social media. Do you think that this is a serious threat?
Right. So Medvedev's role here is to say outrageous things that should provoke fear and consternation in the West and create calls for de-escalation and pulling back on support for Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. What he is saying here is nonsense. First off, Russia is right up there against the border with Ukraine, with Poland through Kaliningrad, with the Baltic states. It has short-range missiles there already. We know this. This is no shock. Second, Russia has been violating every arms control agreement that we signed with them, from the CFE treaty to the INF treaty. It is part of Russia's modus operandi now to just decide not to implement what they don't want to implement. Thirdly, there's been no meaningful change to the West's posture on nuclear weapons at all. There has been a change in Russia's posture of nuclear capable weapons being used in attacking Ukraine. It's like some of the missiles, the caliber missiles that are fired at Ukraine are actually nuclear capable. So what he is saying here is, A, not new, and B, not particularly meaningful. It is only designed to cause some kind of reaction in the West.
Kurt Volker, it's been great to speak to you, former US ambassador to NATO. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
You're listening to Carol Walker on Times Radio.